Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into a claim so astonishing, so transformative, that for billions across the globe, it forms the very bedrock of their faith. We're talking about the resurrection of Jesus. Now, for many, this isn't just a theological concept or, beautiful ancient story. It's presented as a profound historical assertion, a factual event, really.
Exactly. And if it's true, well, it has the power to reshape everything we understand about reality, history, and human purpose. This isn't a topic to be approached lightly. It demands, and it really does invite, the deepest historical and critical scrutiny.
That's precisely our mission for this deep dive. We're going to rigorously scrutinize the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, examining both the claims made and the counter-arguments offered by skeptics. The central question guiding our exploration for you, our listener, is this. Can a historical case be made for the resurrection that stands up to the kind of rigorous inquiry demanded by modern critical historiography?
And to do this, we'll be drawing on a rich collection of scholarly articles, extensive research, and some really compelling discussions. A significant portion of our insights comes from works like The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus by Gary Habermas and Michael Licona. I mean, these guys have dedicated decades to this very question. But we're also integrating various other perspectives, crucially including those from prominent skeptical scholars like, say, Bart Ehrman. Our aim here is to impartially present the arguments and the evidence found within these materials, allowing you to weigh the data for yourself.
Okay, so let's unpack this monumental claim. We're going to begin by focusing on what scholars call the minimal facts approach. This is a fascinating methodology, really, because it zeroes in on historical facts that are so strongly attested by the evidence that they are accepted by a broad consensus of scholars. And I mean a broad consensus, including many who hold skeptical or, non-Christian viewpoints.
That's right. Gary Habermas, building on decades of research, started with a list of about a dozen facts widely accepted by scholars. Through rigorous analysis, often working with Michael Licona, this list has been refined down to a core of 4, sometimes 6 facts. And then there's a very strong +1 fact we'll get to. What's truly fascinating, for historians like myself anyway, is that the scholarly acceptance percentages for these minimal facts aren't static. They've actually been on the rise.
Oh, really?
Yeah. For instance, recent surveys show acceptance for the empty tomb, which is often that +1 fact, moving up to around 80% among critical scholars. It was maybe 75% before. Now, this doesn't mean truth is decided by like a popularity contest, but it does indicate a robust and growing historical foundation that even critical scholars are finding compelling. It suggests that as more evidence is unearthed and analyzed, the case actually gets stronger, not weaker.
That's a really powerful trend to observe. So let's dive into these foundational facts. The first one is absolutely critical: Jesus' death by crucifixion. This isn't just a core belief of Christianity. It's one of the most widely accepted historical facts in all of antiquity. Seriously, we're talking about Jesus dying by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate and being taken off the cross by Joseph of Arimathea. It's not merely attested, it's multiply attested across diverse sources.
Indeed. What's striking about Jesus' crucifixion, it is arguably the single most attested fact in all of ancient history. For a historian, it's as certain as anything from that period can possibly be. The Romans were, well, they were absolute experts at crucifixion. It was their ultimate form of execution, meticulously designed to ensure death, usually through asphyxiation. Their efficiency was brutal, but undeniable. A Roman executioner's life depended on the successful completion of the execution.
Right, no room for error.
None. If they failed at their job, they themselves would have faced severe punishment, maybe even death. They simply did not make mistakes when it came to ensuring their victims were dead. This isn't like, a quick bullet to the head. It's a prolonged, agonizing process engineered for maximum suffering and a guaranteed demise.
And our sources, particularly the medical analyses, go into some truly grim detail about the process, underscoring the severity. We're talking about the scourging first, right? That wasn't just a few lashes.
Oh, no. Far from it.
It was a short whip, often called a flagrum, with leather thongs embedded with small iron balls or sharp pieces of sheep bone tied at intervals. This was designed not just to hurt, but to tear into the victim's back, buttocks, legs, creating deep contusions and lacerations that often exposed muscle and bone.
Yeah, it was intended to weaken them to the brink of collapse or death even before they reached the cross.
Yeah.
Exactly. The iron balls would cause massive bruising, deep tissue damage. The bones would literally rip flesh from the body. Horrific. It was designed to induce hypovolemic shock, that's significant blood loss, extreme pain, pushing the victim to the very edge of life. Then, on the cross, victims could indeed hang for days, enduring dehydration, muscle cramps, excruciating pain. But if the Romans wanted to speed things up, they'd perform the crurifragium, basically breaking the legs with a heavy club.
Ugh.
Yeah. This prevented the victim from pushing up to relieve the strain on their diaphragm, which accelerated death by asphyxiation. And then, as described in John 19.34-35, the spear thrust into Jesus' side. That resulted in an outflow of blood and water. This is medically explained in a really groundbreaking 1986 Journal of the American Medical Association article, JMO.
Right, I've heard of that one.
It concluded that the blood and water likely represented a separation of the blood into clot and serum, indicating profound internal trauma. Things like pleural and pericardial effusions, fluid building up around the lungs and heart. This is a clear sign of heart failure, traumatic shock, or severe injury to the heart or lungs, a wound that would have been undeniably, irrevocably fatal.
So if we connect all this grim medical and historical detail to the bigger picture, wow, it really paints a stark reality. Imagine for a moment you are in that condition, scourged, nailed, speared, then somehow surviving. Now picture yourself trying to roll away a multi-ton stone that sealed the tomb, overcoming trained Roman guards who faced death for dereliction of duty, and then inspiring a movement while you're catastrophically weakened, gasping for air, bleeding out. That idea, frankly, is not just improbable, it's medically absurd, isn't it?
Exactly. It asks us to believe in a series of highly improbable events stacked on top of an already fatal trauma. And the historical context just screams otherwise. Moreover, it's not just the New Testament attesting to his death. Powerful corroboration comes from non-Christian sources, often considered hostile or neutral, which lends significant weight to their accounts.
Right, like who?
Well, take Josephus, the Jewish historian. In his Antiquities of the Jews, written around 93-94 AD, he mentions Jesus, his crucifixion under Pilate, and the continued belief in his resurrection by his followers. Then there's Tacitus, the Roman historian. In his Annals, written around 115-117 AD, he explicitly records that Christus suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilatus.
And these weren't exactly friendly sources, were they?
Not at all. Their inclusion of Jesus' crucifixion, a fact that certainly didn't flatter their own causes, suggests a strong historical reality, not some later fabrication. We also have mentions from figures like Lucian of Samosata, a Greek satirist from the 2nd century AD. He mocked Christians but still affirmed their worship of a crucified sophist. And Marabar Serapion, a Syrian philosopher writing to his son sometime after 70 AD, he lamented the Jews' killing of their wise king, comparing it to Socrates and Pythagoras. Even the Talmud, a collection of Jewish rabbinic writings, contains references to Jesus being executed by hanging on the eve of Passover. It confirms the execution, even if disputes the reasons. The consistency of this testimony across diverse, often adversarial sources, it really underscores the historical certainty of Jesus' death by crucifixion.
That's incredibly compelling. Okay, so having firmly established the brutal reality of Jesus' death, what happened next? What was the immediate aftermath? That leads us to perhaps the most compelling human evidence, the radical change in his disciples. Fact number 2, the disciples' sincere belief in appearances. It's a point on which virtually all scholars, including prominent skeptics like Gerd Ludemann and Paul Fredrickson, agree. The disciples genuinely believed they encountered the risen Jesus. This wasn't some casual conviction. It was a profound, enduring, unwavering certainty.
This is truly a crucial point for any historical analysis. That profound conviction led them to face not just hardship, but imprisonment, torture, and ultimately martyrdom.
Yeah.
The argument liars make poor martyrs is incredibly powerful here. Think about it. People simply do not willingly endure horrific deaths for something they know to be a lie.
Right. It just doesn't make sense psychologically.
Exactly. Contrast this with, say, the Watergate scandal in the 1970s. You remember Watergate, right? That was a lie of far less consequence, a political cover-up, not a claim about the resurrection of God, and yet it collapsed in a matter of weeks under significantly less pressure. Individuals quickly turned on each other to save their own skins, avoid jail time. The disciples, by contrast, faced dungeons, floggings, executions, and there is no credible historical record of any of them recanting their core belief in the resurrection of Jesus. Not a single one. Their unwavering sincerity strongly suggests a genuine, deeply felt conviction based on what they believed they had truly experienced.
Their transformation is key, isn't it? If you look at the Gospels, immediately after Jesus' crucifixion, the disciples are depicted as dejected, terrified, scattered. Peter, the supposed leader, denies Jesus 3 times. They're locked in a room, fearing for their lives, total despair. Yet suddenly, within weeks, they're transformed into these bold, unwavering proclaimers, publicly preaching the resurrection in the very city where Jesus was crucified, willing to suffer persecution and martyrdom. That suggests an utterly powerful, life-altering experience. What else could possibly explain such a radical shift?
It does. And this transformation was immediate. Christianity didn't slowly emerge over centuries as some philosophical school. It began as an explosive resurrection movement. Public preaching started almost immediately after Jesus' death, right there in Jerusalem. This immediate emergence is a critical detail.
Yeah, if it was a later myth, you wouldn't expect that kind of sudden, courageous founding, right?
Precisely. Which brings us to fact number 3, the conversion of Paul.
Ah, Paul. Saul of Tarsus, as he was known then. He wasn't just a non-believer. He was a fervent persecutor of Christians.
Yeah.
Like actively hunting them down, imprisoning them, even consenting to their deaths.
What's truly fascinating here is the sheer drama and unlikeliness of his transformation. From being an enemy of Christians, committed to destroying this burgeoning movement he saw as blasphemous, he became its most influential apostle, writing much of the New Testament. He was certainly not predisposed to belief in a crucified Messiah. In fact, it was a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles, as he himself writes. He hated the idea.
So his conversion is strong evidence because he was coming from such a hostile place.
Exactly. And his conversion is multiply attested in early sources. We have his own direct testimony in his letters, like Galatians and 1 Corinthians, which are incredibly early. We're talking possibly within 20 years of the crucifixion for some of those letters. And then you have 3 accounts in the book of Acts as well. And like the other disciples, Paul himself suffered immense persecution, floggings, shipwrecks, imprisonment, hunger, thirst, and eventually martyrdom for his belief. His life demonstrates the depth of his conviction.
And the timeline significance here is really important for historians, isn't it? Paul's letters largely predate the written Gospels. His earliest letters, like you said, Galatians, 1 Corinthians, written maybe in the early 50s AD, that makes his testimony of Jesus' rising from the dead one of the earliest, if not the most reliable written account we possess of a post-resurrection appearance.
That's absolutely right.
This isn't a story that slowly evolved over generations. It's practically contemporaneous, recorded by someone whose entire life was fundamentally changed by this experience.
Precisely. And that leads us very neatly to fact number 4, the conversion of James, Jesus' own brother.
Right. Another really significant piece of evidence. James was not a follower during Jesus' public ministry. In fact, the Gospels, like Mark 3 and John 7, explicitly state that Jesus' family, including James, thought he was out of his mind. They tried to take him away, maybe embarrassed by his public actions.
He wasn't just a casual unbeliever, he was a familial skeptic, part of Jesus' inner circle, but profoundly unconvinced, maybe even hostile. So his conversion, which tradition says occurred after a personal appearance of the risen Jesus, and this is attested in early creedal material, Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians 15.7, is incredibly significant.
Yeah, this wasn't someone predisposed to belief. This was someone convinced against his deepest inclinations.
Exactly. He transformed from a family skeptic into a prominent, respected leader in the Jerusalem church, eventually known as James the Just. And ultimately, according to historical sources like Josephus, he became a martyr for his faith.
That transformation of a hostile familial skeptic into a devoted leader and martyr, that's powerful evidence.
It's incredibly difficult to imagine what else could have caused such a radical public shift in perspective and commitment from someone who knew Jesus intimately, lived with him, and initially dismissed him. Mere wishful thinking or psychological delusion just doesn't seem to account for such a drastic, life-altering change in someone so personally close and initially resistant.
Okay, and finally, our +1 fact, the empty tomb. Now, while this isn't universally accepted by all critical scholars as a minimal fact, the consensus is usually considered above 90% for those core facts, and this one hovers around, what, 75, 80%?
Yeah, around 75–80%, though, as I mentioned, that number seems to be climbing.
Right. But it is very strongly supported by a confluence of historical evidence, and its inclusion truly strengthens the overall case.
Its importance, though, cannot be overstated. Consider what we call the Jerusalem factor. Early Christian preaching of the resurrection began right in Jerusalem, the very city where Jesus was crucified and buried. Think about that.
Okay.
If the body had still been in the tomb, opponents could have easily produced it to refute the claims. That would have stopped the movement dead in its tracks. All they had to do was point to the body. See? He's right here, still dead.
But they didn't.
But there's absolutely no record of this happening, no counterclaim of we found the body. This implicitly suggests the body's absence was a practical necessity for the movement's survival and explosive growth in the very heart of Judea. Even a decomposed corpse, presented as a decaying fraud, would have been useful to discredit the claims, but nothing of the sort was ever produced. The silence on this front is, well, it's deafening.
What's really interesting here, too, is the enemy attestation. Early Jewish critics didn't say, he's still in the tomb, go check. Instead, their counterargument was that the disciples had stolen the body. This is explicitly recorded in Matthew 28:1-13 and later echoed by figures like Justin Martyr and Tertullian.
That's a crucial insight. That accusation, by its very nature, implicitly admits the tomb was empty. They had to acknowledge the body's absence to even begin their counterargument. If the tomb wasn't empty, they would have simply pointed to the body. End of story.
Makes sense.
And then there's what scholars call the testimony of women. The gospel accounts consistently portray women as the primary witnesses to the empty tomb.
Which was unusual back then.
Very. This is what historians call an embarrassing detail. Because in first-century Jewish and Roman cultures, women's testimony was not highly regarded in legal settings. It was often considered unreliable. If the resurrection story were a fabrication, the gospel writers would almost certainly have depicted men discovering the tomb's vacancy to give it more credibility and social acceptance in that cultural context.
Ah, I see. So making women the key witnesses wouldn't be the smart play if you were inventing the story.
Exactly. The inclusion of women as primary witnesses, despite the cultural bias against their testimony, strongly suggests authenticity rather than a convenient invention designed for maximum societal impact. It's a detail that argues for historical veracity. It rings true precisely because it's inconvenient.
So, wow. We have these incredibly compelling facts supported by broad scholarly consensus. Jesus' certain death by crucifixion, the disciples' profound and sincere belief in appearances, the radical conversions of hostile skeptics like Paul and James, and the strong evidence for the empty tomb. Considering even enemy attestation and the surprising testimony of women, these are the historical pillars. But as we know, for any historical claim, especially one of this magnitude, skeptics offer alternative explanations. It's crucial we address these yes-but arguments head-on.
Absolutely. Intellectual honesty demands it. A robust historical hypothesis must account for the full spectrum of established facts, not just cherry-pick the bits that are convenient or fit a preconceived worldview. We need to rigorously examine if any naturalistic explanation can adequately fit all these established facts, or if they crumble under scrutiny when held against the complete body of evidence.
Okay, let's start with the stolen body theory. The premise here is that Jesus' disciples, perhaps to fulfill his own prophecies, took his body. Maybe bribing the Roman guards to spread a false story, like Matthew's gospel suggests the Jewish leaders did.
Right. This theory faces significant, almost insurmountable challenges when weighed against those minimal facts we just discussed. Firstly, the disciples, as we said, were in hiding. They were convinced Jesus was dead. When the women initially reported Jesus' resurrection, Luke 24 tells us their words seemed like idle tales, and they didn't believe them.
They were scared, disheartened.
Utterly without hope. So it's incredibly unlikely that these very men who had fled for their lives while Jesus was still alive, and then hid in fear, could suddenly muster the courage, the cunning, the ingenuity to overcome a Roman guard detail who, let's remember, faced capital punishment for falling asleep or failing their duty,
Right.
steal the body from a heavily guarded tomb, and then boldly preach and teach about a Jesus they knew was still dead. A known lie.
The liars make poor martyrs. Point comes back strong here.
It applies forcefully. People simply don't willingly endure horrific deaths, torture, and widespread persecution for a known fabrication. And again, the absence of the corpse argument. If the body was stolen, why didn't the authorities recover it, or at least make a stronger case than the disciples took it? Producing the body would have ended everything. Their failure to do so is a powerful argument against this theory.
Yeah, okay, what about the swoon theory? This idea suggests Jesus didn't actually die on the cross. He just passed out, maybe fainted from exhaustion and pain, and then revived in the cool air of the tomb.
Ah, the swoon theory. This one faces severe medical and historical implausibility. As we've detailed, Roman guards were expert executioners. Crucifixion was designed to ensure death, usually by asphyxiation, and they were meticulous. And that 1986 JAMA article, again, medically confirms that the spear thrust into Jesus' side, yielding blood and water, indicates a pierced heart or lung cavity with fluid accumulation, a fatal wound. period.
Right.
So to suggest that a man who had endured the brutal scourging, the nail wounds, the suffocation of the cross, the spear thrust, and then survived 3 days in a tomb without food, water, or medical attention, could then somehow roll away a multi-ton stone and overpower trained Roman guards while catastrophically weakened, it's not just improbable. It's medically preposterous.
And think about the aftermath, too. If Jesus had somehow survived in such a severely weakened state, picture this half-dead Jesus limping, bleeding, pale, stooped over in pain, suffering from unimaginable trauma. He would hardly inspire his disciples to proclaim him a victorious conqueror of death, the Prince of Life, risen in glory, would he?
Not at all. They would have sought urgent medical help for him. They'd be trying to nurse him back to health, not starting a global movement based on a triumphant resurrection. The physical reality of such a survival simply doesn't fit the dramatic transformation of the disciples or the content of their message. The swoon theory just collapses under both medical and psychological scrutiny. It fails to account for really any of the minimal facts beyond maybe the empty tomb itself.
Okay, good points. Next, let's tackle hallucination or delusion theories. The premise here is that the disciples, Paul or James, experienced subjective visions, maybe mass hysteria or some kind of collective delusion due to grief, stress, or charismatic leaders.
This is a common naturalistic alternative. You hear it a lot, but it has profound difficulties. The primary problem is that hallucinations are, by definition, almost always private individual experiences. Rooted in the individual's brain chemistry and psychology, there is simply no known psychological or medical case documented in clinical literature of group hallucinations where multiple individuals independently experience the same specific person repeatedly, saying the same specific things, and interacting physically like eating, touching, walking, especially over a sustained period like 40 days, and across diverse groups, the 12, the 500 plus.
So one person hallucinating is possible, but a whole group having the exact same hallucination at the same time.
It's unprecedented and highly improbable. While stress or shared emotional states can induce individual hallucinations, they do not produce shared, identical sensory experiences across diverse groups. If it were possible, imagine the implications for, like, legal systems or mental health diagnoses. It's just not how hallucinations work.
And when you consider the conversions of Paul and James, the theory faces even greater hurdles, right?
Absolutely. Paul's transformation from a hostile persecutor, or James's from a familial skeptic, it makes subjective visions highly unlikely for them. They weren't in a frame of mind predisposed to such experiences or wishful thinking. Quite the opposite.
They weren't grieving followers desperate to see Jesus again.
Exactly. The conversion disorder theory, for instance, a psychological condition where mental conflict gets converted into physical symptoms, has been proposed for Paul. But it's largely rejected by scholars, including even former atheist Antony Flew, because it fails to explain other details. It doesn't account for Paul's companions also seeing the same blinding light and hearing a voice, or the appearances to others who are not experiencing the same psychological state. Furthermore, the accounts consistently describe physical interactions with Jesus eating with them, inviting Thomas to touch his wounds, walking with disciples, which directly counters the idea of purely subjective visions. Hallucinations are internal. These accounts describe external, physical interactions.
Right, that physical aspect is key. Okay, another common objection is the legend myth theory. This posits that the resurrection story was merely a fable that evolved over time, maybe influenced by pagan myths of dying and rising gods that were around back then.
Okay, two parts to that. First, the legend accretion idea. It's true that some legends can accumulate over time. However, the textual purity of the New Testament itself is rarely questioned in serious scholarship. The Greek text we have is remarkably close to what was originally written. What scholars do debate is whether legend crept into Christian traditions before they were written down.
In the oral period.
Right. But here, early Christian creeds, like the one Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians 15:3-8, are critical. Many scholars date its origin within 5 years of Jesus' crucifixion. Some say even earlier, maybe 2 or 3 years.
Wow, that early.
Yes. These creeds are short, concise, rhythmic, formulaic statements of belief easily memorized and passed on orally. Scholars recognize their pre-Pauline origin, meaning they were already established traditions before Paul wrote his letter, and certainly predating the written Gospels. This indicates an extremely early communal belief based on eyewitness testimony, not a slowly evolving myth over generations. Minor discrepancies in the Gospels, which critics sometimes point to as proof of fabrication, actually suggest independent accounts rather than collusion. If they were invented, they'd likely be perfectly harmonized, wouldn't they?
Good point. Like witnesses to an accident giving slightly different details.
Exactly. And while accounts of, say, Joseph of Arimathea show slight legendary development over maybe 30 years, the core events of Jesus' death and the belief in his resurrection appearances are recorded too early for such extensive mythical accretion to explain the radical transformation of an entire movement.
Okay, and what about those pagan parallels? Stories like Osiris, Tammuz, Adonis, Attis, Marduk, the claim that Christians just copied or were inspired by these dying and rising god myths.
Right, you hear that a lot in popular level discussions, especially online. But while such claims were popular maybe a century ago, the majority of critical scholars today actually say no. These parallels are largely superficial and, frankly, unconvincing when you look closely. These pagan stories look very little like Jesus' resurrection. They often lack clear death and resurrection narratives in the Christian sense, or crucially, they were written centuries after Jesus, making influence in that direction impossible.
Like the Adonis story.
Yeah, the resurrection part of the Adonis story isn't reported until after AD 150, way too late to influence first century Christians. Many of these myths describe assignment to the underworld or a cyclical agricultural rebirth representing the seasons, not a unique, physical, singular resurrection from the dead in history. And critically, they lack the strong historical evidence found for Jesus' resurrection, things like multiply attested, early eyewitnesses, specific historical context. Their origins are in mythology, not historical reporting. To claim them as parallels requires, honestly, a significant reinterpretation of the pagan myths and an ignoring of the unique historical claims of the New Testament. Most specialists in ancient religions just don't see a strong connection anymore.
Okay, that's clarifying. Let's get into some of the more philosophical objections now. Many skeptics argue that science proves miracles are impossible, or that miracles by their very nature have an astronomically low antecedent probability, making them inherently unbelievable regardless of evidence.
This is a significant philosophical hurdle for some, absolutely. And it really hinges on one's worldview, their presuppositions about reality. However, the scientific method, while incredibly powerful and effective for understanding the natural world, has inherent limitations. It cannot measure love with a Geiger counter, right? Nor can it objectively relive the dinosaur era. To claim that truth is found only in what science can prove is actually a self-refuting statement.
That was so.
Because that claim itself, that only science yields truth, cannot be scientifically proven. It's a philosophical assertion, a statement about science, not a statement of science. A scientist locked in a room with all the latest equipment cannot scientifically prove that only science yields truth. The rule itself is unscientific. So it's illegitimate to demand that religious claims be proven in a test tube. That's asking science to operate outside its own defined domain. Science describes how the universe usually operates. It doesn't dictate what is possible beyond those operations if an external, non-natural cause exists.
But if we're open to something beyond purely naturalistic explanations, then the plausibility of God's existence becomes profoundly relevant to the possibility of miracles, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Cosmological arguments for God's existence, things like intelligent design, the first cause argument stemming from evidence like the Big Bang, the incredible fine-tuning of cosmic constants needed for life, these address that a priori objection to miracles. If there is a powerful, intelligent being who created and sustains the universe, then miracles are not only possible, but perhaps even expected within the context of that being's interaction with creation. Arno Penzias, a Nobel laureate for his work on Big Bang evidence, famously noted that the universe's life-permitting constants strongly suggest an underlying, one might say, supernatural plan.
Interesting quote.
If such a plan exists, then a miracle like the resurrection isn't some random anomaly in a closed system, but potentially an intentional act within a larger open system.
And Jesus' resurrection isn't just an isolated random event, is it? It occurred in this interconnected religio-historical context. His claims to divinity, his numerous miracles during his ministry, his predictions of his own resurrection, all of these give a contextual plausibility to such an extraordinary event. It's not totally out of the blue.
That's vital. It's the difference between hearing that, I don't know, your random grandfather rose from the dead versus Jesus, whose entire life and claims align perfectly with such an event. He predicted it. His other powerful acts were consistent with a divine agent. The resurrection fits right at home, in a way, in the narrative of Jesus. Furthermore, critics often fall into what you might call a naturalism of the gaps view. They deny the resurrection simply because it's supernatural, without offering a viable, natural counter-explanation that accounts for all the facts. When adequate historical evidence is available, we shouldn't just suspend judgment because it challenges a naturalistic worldview. That's not intellectual honesty, that's methodological bias, assuming the answer before looking at the evidence.
Finally, we often hear the maxim, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The resurrection, being so radical and unique, certainly seems to require more evidence than, say, the crucifixion of some minor historical figure.
We completely agree that the maxim has common sense appeal, and we argue that we do have enough evidence, in fact, an overwhelming amount, to satisfy such a requirement. The collection of historical data, the consistent appearances to individuals and groups, to friends, enemies, skeptics, the demonstrably empty tomb, and the systematic failure of all naturalistic counter-theories to adequately explain the entire body of evidence that makes Jesus' resurrection the most plausible explanation, historically speaking. What's often overlooked, and what's fascinating here, is that the requirement for extraordinary evidence cuts both ways.
How do you mean?
All those opposing naturalistic theories we just discussed, the stolen body by terrified disciples, the swoon despite fatal wounds, the mass identical hallucinations, the instant legend creation, these are themselves extremely improbable, if not practically impossible, given the established historical facts. They are extraordinary claims in their own right.
Ah,
Thus, they also face the same challenge for extraordinary evidence, and, as we've shown, they consistently fall short. To cling to an improbable naturalistic explanation rather than accept a more historically plausible supernatural one is itself a form of bias.
that's a powerful point. If the naturalistic explanations themselves are so improbable, then they too require extraordinary evidence to be accepted, and our sources suggest they lack it. Let's delve back into the nature of Jesus' appearances for a moment. You mentioned their diversity and physicality, which is crucial for discrediting those hallucination theories.
Yes, it's critical to reemphasize that. The accounts describe incredibly diverse appearances. Jesus appeared to individuals like Mary Magdalene and Peter, and to large groups like the 12 disciples and the more than 500 people mentioned by Paul. These appearances occurred to friends, to foes like Paul, and to skeptics like James. They happened in different places: a garden, a road, a locked room, a mountain in Galilee, the shore of the Sea of Tiberias, and under various circumstances over a span of 40 days. And critically, these weren't just fleeting mental images. They involved physical interaction. Jesus ate with them, invited Thomas to touch his wounds, walked with disciples on the road to Emmaus. This widespread, diverse, persistent, and physical nature makes a single psychological explanation, like mass hallucination or collective delusion, highly improbable. In the extreme, hallucinations just aren't like that individual, subjective, not shared in such specific detail or physicality across such varied groups and situations.
And while Paul's conversion experience was described as a blinding light and a voice, which some critics interpret as non-physical, you're saying he consistently implies a bodily resurrection elsewhere.
Absolutely. In his writings and as recorded in Acts, he speaks of a transformed spiritual body. But he doesn't mean an immaterial ghost. He contrasts it with our current weak natural body. This resurrected body is transformed, holy, powerful, glorious, incorruptible, perfectly suited for eternal life. But it's still a body. Look at Acts 13, 1 Corinthians 15, Philippians 3, Romans 8. He makes it clear this is a bodily event, not merely a spirit appearing. It's a body uniquely suited for the resurrection life.
Okay.
And the Gospels themselves corroborate this physicality in really undeniable ways. Matthew 28 describes the woman actually touching Jesus' feet. Luke 24 and John 20 recount Jesus inviting Thomas to touch his wounds, explicitly saying he has flesh and bones, not merely a spirit.
And the eating.
Right. Luke 24 and John 21 show Jesus eating fish and bread with his disciples, demonstrating his physical post-resurrection hunger and ability to consume food. These details are powerfully counterintuitive if the story were simply fabricated to align with common expectations of the afterlife back then, which often lean towards a spiritual, disembodied existence. In fact, early critics, like Celsus in the 2nd century, actually argued against a literal bodily resurrection, implying that this is precisely what Christians were claiming, a physical, not just spiritual return. Their arguments confirm what Christians believed.
Wow. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. The resurrection's profound significance. For the early Christians, Jesus' resurrection wasn't a minor detail or some optional belief, was it? It was the absolute focal point of their teachings, the driving force behind their entire movement. Paul emphatically stated, if Christ has not been raised, your faith is worthless and you are still in your sins. That's from 1 Corinthians 15. Pretty clear statement about its absolute centrality.
It's the undisputed cornerstone of Christian faith. And Jesus himself seems to have offered his resurrection as the ultimate test, the test by which we could know that he was telling the truth regarding his radical claims claims to divinity, claims about his unique role in salvation. It stands as a historical test of truth unique to Christianity. If he didn't rise, he was a false prophet, maybe a deluded man, and his claims were empty. But if he did rise, it confirmed absolutely everything he said and did. It validated his life, his teachings, his identity.
So the resurrection justified both his life and his claims, didn't it? His
Yeah.
favorite self-designation, Son of Man, which is attested across various gospel sources, and seems unlikely to have been invented by the church because it was kind of humble,
Hmm.
and his more direct claims to be the Son of God, like in Mark 13, Matthew 11, Mark 14, those are also strongly supported by early tradition. The resurrection provides cosmic validation for all of that.
Absolutely. And you have to remember, for Jews of that time, a crucified Messiah was an oxymoron. It was an alien concept, a contradiction in terms. And a physical resurrection was often seen as something reserved for the general resurrection at the end of time, not for an individual in the middle of history. So a crucified Messiah who rose physically, that would have been seen as scandalous, laughable, maybe even blasphemous.
Not what people were expecting.
Not at all. Yet this became the very core message that exploded out of Jerusalem, which indicates a profound conviction rooted in undeniable actual events. This was not a story designed to appeal to Jewish expectations or Roman sensibilities. It was a radical departure that required incredible, compelling evidence to be embraced by anyone, let alone an entire movement willing to die for it.
And when we talk about history, we need to be clear. We're not talking about 100% certainty in the scientific or mathematical sense, are we? History deals in probabilities and the weighing of evidence. We know George Washington was the first president of the United States with a very high degree of certainty, even though none of us were there and we can't prove it in a lab.
Exactly. That's a great analogy. The standard for historical proof requires that the reasons for accepting an event significantly outweigh the reasons for not accepting it. If there are no reasonable opposing theories that can adequately explain all the facts, a finding of historicity becomes the default position, really. And the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, when weighed by these rigorous historical standards, is not just good, it's exceptionally good. The sheer weight of converging, independent early testimony, coupled with the systematic failure of all those naturalistic counter-explanations, it makes it a very strong historical finding. For a historian looking purely at the data, it is simply the most plausible explanation for the facts we possess.
So what does this all mean for you, our listener, as you maybe engage with others who might be curious or skeptical about these claims?
Yeah.
How can you apply this knowledge in conversations and discussions?
Right, this is where the people skills really come in. Because having the knowledge is one thing, sharing it effectively is another. First and foremost, humility and love. Knowledge can, unfortunately, lead to arrogance, as Paul warned in 1 Corinthians 8. Knowledge makes arrogant, but love edifies. Okay. Instead, approach discussions with humility, patience, and love. As 1 Peter 3 advises, be ready to give a reason for your hope, but do it with gentleness and respect. And Jude encourages showing mercy. The goal isn't to win an argument or dominate a conversation. It's to genuinely connect, share truth respectfully, and invite understanding.
And be a genuinely good listener. That's huge. Let others express their views fully without jumping in or formulating your rebuttal while they're still talking. Ask clarifying questions. Try to truly understand their concerns, their doubts, their particular philosophical hurdles. Building trust by genuinely listening makes them far more likely to listen to you in return when it's your turn to share. It's about building a bridge, right? Not a wall.
Absolutely. And crucially, try to stay focused on the subject of Jesus' resurrection. It's easy to get sidetracked. If a skeptical friend raises unrelated objections like the problem of evil or alleged Bible contradictions or the Crusades, whatever, acknowledge them as valid questions, important questions, perhaps for a separate discussion. You could say something like, "That's a great and important question, and I'd love to discuss it with you. Maybe we can set aside time for that." But for now, let's keep our focus on the historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection. Gently steer back to the core evidence for the resurrection. Remind them, perhaps, that an unanswered question in one area doesn't nullify compelling evidence in another.
And it's perfectly okay, even commendable, to admit when you don't know the answer to a specific detail. Saying, you know what, I honestly don't know the answer to that right now, but I'll look into it and get back to you, builds far more credibility and trust than making something up or trying to bluff your way through. Intellectual honesty is paramount.
Absolutely. Be a learner yourself. And finally, maybe be cautious of easily dismissible false information or urban legends that sometimes circulate and can cause severe doubts if taken at face value. For example, some claims about, say, the Christian fish symbol being invented for the age of Pisces are easily refuted by historical and astronomical facts, yet they can be very damaging to someone's faith if unchecked. Always try to verify the foundation of claims, especially those that sound too neat or too dismissive of deeply held beliefs. Do your homework. Check the sources.
Excellent practical advice. Okay, so to recap this extensive deep dive, we've scrutinized the historical evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. We explored the powerful minimal facts approach, focusing on pillars of evidence accepted by a broad consensus of scholars. Jesus' certain death by crucifixion.
Yep, attested by multiple sources, including non-Christian ones.
The disciples' sincere belief in appearances, leading to their radical transformation and martyrdom.
Can't explain that away easily.
The radical conversions of hostile skeptics like Paul and James.
Huge turnarounds.
And the strong historical support for the empty tomb, even considering enemy attestation and the surprising testimony of women.
All right, putting all those pieces together, and we systematically addressed common opposing naturalistic theories, the soul and body, the swoon, the hallucination, the legend myth theories. We showed how they struggle profoundly to adequately explain all the established facts when considered together. They tend to explain one piece but fail on others. We also discussed philosophical objections to miracles, demonstrating how they often stem from an unproven naturalistic worldview and the contextual plausibility of Jesus' resurrection given his life and claims. The cumulative historical data, when considered together and weighed impartially against alternative explanations, point strongly to Jesus' physical resurrection as the most plausible and compelling explanation for the rise of Christianity.
So a powerful thought for you, our listener, to mull over as we close. If the historical evidence for the resurrection is as robust as our sources suggest, if it really does stand up to rigorous scrutiny, what does that mean for your understanding of reality, of human purpose, of what truly might be possible beyond our everyday experience?
And remember, this deep dive is just a starting point for your own journey into knowledge and understanding. We encourage continued exploration and dialogue. Dig into the sources yourself, engage with others, keep asking questions. What stands out to you from this discussion? What questions remain? That's where the real learning continues.